Hey everybody, welcome to the What is Money Show. I am thrilled to have you here joining me on my mission to help shine light on the corruption of money. Now, if this is your first time listening to the What is Money Show, I strongly recommend that you go back to episodes 1 through 9 first, which lays a lot of the groundwork for many of the concepts that we explore on the show. These first 9 episodes are my series with Michael Saylor, and thousands of people have told me that this is the best podcast series they've ever heard, hands down, and that it was instrumental to their understanding of money and Bitcoin. So if you're looking to start a deep dive into the nature of money, I don't think there's any place better that you can start other than episode 1 of this show. Now, a little bit about this show and how it makes money. The What is Money Show is 100% sponsor based. So all of our revenues are derived from direct sponsorships. And I strive to be very selective about the sponsors that I work with, specifically only using sponsors that I use personally, and also choosing sponsors that have values which are well aligned to the values expressed on this show, such as freedom, education, self-sovereignty, etc. So what I'm going to do now is a few ad reads right at the top of the show, and then I'll do a few more ad reads in the middle. And I hope you'll take the time to listen to them, as again, these are hand-selected sponsors, and I think you'll like what they have to offer. Today's podcast is brought to you by In Wolf's Clothing. Wolf is the first startup accelerator dedicated exclusively to the Bitcoin Lightning Network. 4 times per year, Wolf brings teams from around the world to New York City to work with like-minded entrepreneurs, pushing the boundaries of what's possible with Bitcoin and Lightning. The program is designed to help early-stage companies achieve product-market fit, develop their brand, secure early-stage funding, and grow businesses that help fuel the global adoption of Bitcoin. So go to wolfnyc.com to learn more about the program or apply. Again, that's Wolf NYC, WOLFNYC.com.
Luke DeWolf, welcome back to the What is Money Show.
Thanks, Robert. Thanks for having me back. It's been a little while coming. We had a bit of a mishap on our last recording session, so glad we could reschedule and continue our series.
Exciting developments in your life. I don't know if you want to call it a mishap, but yeah, life happens, as we say.
Absolutely. My son arrived 5 weeks early, and so a little bit of a surprise, but yeah, everything good, all healthy. On the same day we're going to record, so that was a funny happenstance.
That's so awesome. Very, very happy for you. As I was telling you offline, enjoy those early days because they go really fast. We are continuing our journey into Jordan Peterson's book, Maps of Meaning. And I guess we're jumping into some the whole book is dense, but we're jumping into some more dense material today. And before we do that, maybe it would be useful for you to just give a little brief summary / recap of where we've been thus far.
Yeah. So the main thing that I wanted to highlight getting into this chapter, we're starting on the chapter number 4, the appearance of anomaly. And basically what this means is the challenge to the shared map concept that we've been talking about. And so the recap that I wanted to get into was last time we built up the concept of apprenticeship. In other words, the way that individuals form a shared map with their cultural peers, essentially. And that was an important process. But then what happens when you've got this shared map together and there are some challenges to that? And this is going to be as you say, a really dense chapter. And it's going to be introducing a couple of new concepts to build on. And then we're going to get into what the effects are when there are challenges to this shared map together. So I think that's pretty much where we are.
Yeah, indeed. And I think the term shared map will become more clear as we go along here. Again, because this is very deep content, like it's mythological / psychological in nature, we find a lot of overlapping with just general things like culture, but also things like money, other social constructs. It really seems to permeate a lot of domains of human existence. And so what I'll do now is read a rather long excerpt at the beginning of the chapter, which lays the groundwork for some of this. And again, will also give you a sense of how dense Peterson's writing really is. And then don't hope for the listeners that may be new to this, don't get intimidated. We'll read it now in all its density, and then we'll try to work through it and parse it out as we go. So Peterson writes, moral behaviors and schemas of valuation arise as a consequence of behavioral interaction undertaken in the social world. Every individual, motivated to regulate his emotions through action, modifies the behavior of others operating in the same environment. The consequences of this mutual modification, operating over time, is the emergence of a stable pattern of behavior, quote unquote, designed to match individual and social needs simultaneously. Eventually, this behavioral pattern comes to be coded in image, heralded in narrative, explicitly represented in words, in the integrated individual or the integrated state. Action, imagination, and explicit verbal thought are isomorphic. Explicit and image-mediated beliefs and actual behaviors form a coherent unit. Verbal theories of morality, explicit rules, match traditional images of moral behavior, and action undertaken remains in concordance with both. This integrated morality lends predictability to behavior, constitutes the basis for the stable state, and helps ensure that emotion remains under control. So that's setting up the nature of the structure, which we'll get into. And then there are challenges to that structure or means by which that structure becomes modified. This is not necessarily a negative thing. It's also it's an intrinsic part of the structure's adaptivity. And so I'll continue. And this is sort of like an abstract on what we're going to get into. So the second part of the long excerpt, Peterson writes, if I can get my computer to show it. The emergence of anomaly constitutes a threat to the integrity of the moral tradition governing behavior and evaluation. Strange things or situations can pose a challenge to the structure of a given system of action and related beliefs. Can pose such a challenge at comparatively restricted, quote unquote, normal or broader, quote unquote, revolutionary levels of organization. A prolonged drought, for example, destructive at the social level, or the occurrence of a serious illness or disability, destructive at the personal, can force the reconstruction of behavior and the reanalysis of beliefs that accompany, follow, or underlie such behavior. The appearance of a stranger, or more commonly a group of strangers, may produce a similar effect. The stranger acts out and holds different beliefs using different implements and concepts. The mere existence of these anomalous beliefs, actions, and tools, generally the consequence of prolonged, complex, and powerful social evolutionary processes, may be sufficient to totally transform or even destroy the culture which encounters them unprepared. Cultures may be upset internally as well as a consequence of the quote unquote strange idea or similarly by the actions of the revolutionary. Okay, so that's a mouthful to get started, but in a very brief summary, we construct shared codes of behavior or maps, or what we will later call a paradigmatic structure for coordinating human action across time and space. But that structure needs to adapt to changes in reality, both physical reality, technological reality, epistemic reality, as we learn and discover new things. And the challenges or adaptations are brought into that structure through what we said, the strange, the stranger, or the strange idea.
Yeah, so I think that's a great summary. And now, I mean, again, we're getting started here, and what I like about this chapter and what this is sort of setting out in front of us, I guess, is that we are talking about the way that we as individuals relate to one another in a cultural sense. That's what we're sort of introducing as this paradigmatic structure of
Mm-hmm.
that's the first half of what you read is what that's
Mm-hmm.
building up. And this structure, right? What he's describing here in the abstract is essentially there's these layers that
Mm-hmm.
build up over time on top of one another that
Mm-hmm.
get more and more specific. So we have this substrate of really base shared human thinking that really might be universal.
Yeah.
And then we get more and more specific as layers on top of
Mm-hmm.
this base, basically,
Mm-hmm.
all the way up until you get to smaller and smaller cultural units. Like you could say that every, I don't know, nation state or ethnic group or something like that kind of has their own way of viewing the world, so to
Yes.
say. And then you get down even further to the level of, say, an individual town
Mm-hmm.
or even then a family group or
Yeah.
a group of friends, something like that, the
Yeah.
tribe.
Yes.
And ultimately you get the individual at the
Yeah.
very top of that. And each individual gets their own ways of thinking, right? So
Mm-hmm.
that's the first part of what we're going to talk about. And then the second, as you say, this strange things, strangers, and strange ideas.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is like the primary ways that this stuff gets challenged and how we deal with that. And so I think this is these are big ideas and complex ideas and maybe a little bit uncomfortable as well. I think the when we're talking about the strange things, strangers, strange ideas,
Mm-hmm.
there's some uncomfortable ideas there too. So we can definitely dig into that.
Yeah, well, they uncomfortable is the right word because comfortable would be sitting within the predictable, familiar structure, right? No, nothing unexpected is happening. Uncomfortable is when something new is introduced, right? Because you have to, well, adapt and assimilate to the novelty. This could be a new philosophical idea. This could be a new radical new form of art. This could be a new social movement, a new political party, uh, something physical, even, right? Like a natural disaster. Like there's always something, any number, the higher the domain of shared experience, the shared map can be disrupted in a number of ways, let's say. Um, and so I like your point there too, that each group of this applies at every level, basically, right? This could apply to the family level of social grouping, the town, the city, etc. You could also even argue, as Peterson later does, the individual is a collection of internalized other individuals. Like we have become who we've interacted with over time. So we have competing perspectives and opinions and motivations within us. So even the individual himself is sort of like one of these, a microcosm of these groupings. Um, so as such, I'll go on to read another excerpt here. This we're going to use the term paradigmatic structure of the known, which is what he uses in the book. It's inherently hierarchical because it has to be, right? There's competing perspectives and whatnot within it. So Peterson writes, the known is a hierarchical structure composed of quote unquote walls within walls. The individual sits at the middle of a series of concentric rings composed of the integrated personalities of his ancestors, nested, at least in the ideal, within the figure of the exploratory hero. The inner walls are dependent for their protection, for their continued existence and validity, on the integrity of the outer walls. The farther down a given wall, the more implicit its structure. That is, the more it is incarnated in behavior and image, rather than explicit in word. And this is something we've referred to, I think, in this series a couple of times as like latent cultural programming. Right? We have certain moral intuitions that we just have as a result of coming up in culture that aren't necessarily built in from the beginning of human existence, right? The moral intuition to not harm others, just to steal from others. I don't, who knows how deep that goes, but it is something that we had to acculturate over time. So I'll throw it over to you. Oh, let me read one more piece here, then I'll throw it over to you. A little further down, he writes, this is tying in rituals. Rituals designed to strengthen group identity, hold chaos at bay, but threaten individual identification with the exploratory hero, an identity upon which maintenance of the group ultimately depends. For the sake of the group, therefore, the individual must not be rendered subservient to the group. So there's this dynamic tension between two opposing forces, right? The purpose of this paradigmatic structure of the known is to create social cohesion. So you want people to group together and conform to a common code, yet you also need them to remain individuals, right? Not fully uniform, so that we can leverage the talents, expertise, know-how of each, the perspective of each, and maintain the potential to be that exploratory hero, to figure out something new, innovate something new, discover something new, see something the rest of the group isn't seeing, basically. And it's that sort of static, dynamic, the tension between the static and the dynamic that seems to cohere cultural integrity, but also give it some adaptivity at the edges, something like that.
Yeah, what a great quote, right? What a great paragraph. I think this is a fantastic point, and again, one of those things that's a little uncomfortable to wrestle with, right? Dealing with the first part of what you brought up here, what you just talked about, the known as the hierarchical structure. So the thing here, what it's getting at is that when he says the inner walls are dependent for their protection on the outer walls, uh, there's a great diagram a few pages into this, 242 in my copy here, that shows this pattern of concentric rings, basically, on how personality gets built up all the way from essentially a very basic substructure. And I can read out what the diagram actually says. So in the example of a father and husband from a Western culture, that's the ultimate example, and well, works pretty well for me. Yeah. So the exploratory hero is the very base. The exploratory hero being everything that we've covered in the previous chapters, right? But then it gets into that the Judeo-Christian personality, the humanistic Western personality, the American personality, or Canadian or Western, whatever, the capitalist personality, the middle class businessman, and then the father and husband.
Yes.
Eventually getting into build up this hypothetical or not so hypothetical individual. I know plenty of individuals just like this describing that image, right? And the thing about this is the most general is on the outside, this exploratory hero, and the implication is that this meta mythology,
yes,
this central story, is what underlies all of it, right? So the implication here is that without respecting those ideas, we run counter to the basic programming underlying not just individuals but groups and cultures, right? And I think that's incredibly important here. And then the rest of this, right, that groups and individuals may share some levels of the known, but not everything, right?
Yeah.
I mean, this is the point that gets into how we have differences of opinion and differences in experiences, and it's really a powerful concept, this paradigmatic structure of the known. I really like it. And then the add-on here, rituals designed to strengthen the group identity, hold chaos at bay. Like, wow, it's like without that, it's showing the purpose of why we group together and do these things that may seem why do we do this? Why do we have
Mm-hmm.
Christmas and Easter in general Western society, right?
Yeah.
Like, what's actually the purpose of doing that?
Right.
Getting together and coheating, uh, going to church on Sunday, if you're a Christian,
Yeah.
or whatever it is for
Mm-hmm.
every other religion, right? These
Mm-hmm.
rituals are there to strengthen the group, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this can get really uncomfortable in the thinking for when the centralization force has been so strong over the last couple of centuries that we're in a world that is incredibly centralized and incredibly controlled, and that maybe there's a decentralization push, right? Movement. But then the idea is you can't really get away from that the group is still something central there. Getting together and working together as a group is still important. That's what these paragraphs are starting to get at for me.
Yeah, well, it's just essential. I mean, ritual might be a word that's off-putting to some people, but I would say, if you work in a company, you have rituals, right? You go to meetings, you do company outings, you probably have certain operational structures that are ritualized, right? Um, Economics at large would be a ritual. We're coordinating human action, we're interconnecting these businesses and jobs. Obviously, things that are more religious in nature, like fasting, praying, avoiding certain foods. These are all things that are really designed to enhance our ability to flourish, frankly, right? Either keeping us healthy or helping us become more productive or otherwise protect us from the chaos, right? Whatever that chaos may be, whether that's disease or famine or the elements, whatever it may be. And yeah, I think, and the other thing, the nested structure too. Again, it's it's you, right? You are a nested structure. You kind of have this very, even the brain is structured this way, right? We have the reptilian brain at the core, and then the higher levels are more mammalian, more social and whatnot. And then systems wise, well, we have, and he shows this, right? The legal system depends on an ethical system, but the ethical system depends on a moral philosophy. And then the moral philosophy depends on a mythology or a religion. So, in that the arrow of implicitness is towards the I think it was the outer shell, right? So the religion is the most implicit. It's like the substrate to this whole nested structure, or mythology, if you want to use that term. And the most explicit, it would be the actual acculturated individual, right? The Western father or businessman or whatever it may be. So there's all this implicit, latent cultural programming that underpins that individual personality. And that's why, and you can't pull the substrate out without obviously preventing that ability of the individual to remain an individual.
Exactly. And I think the key thing here, another uncomfortable part is that you can't get rid of the substrate of what we're talking about as Judeo-Christian personality. I think
Mhm.
that it's really important to emphasize this. And this is one of those things that was maybe a little uncomfortable to me
Mhm.
for a while, having my own religious baggage, right? Is like this is a part of Western society. And I think one point where maybe I'm not sure Dr. Peterson gets the full picture here though, is that every culture also has other substrates to this, right?
Sure.
So if someone is of Western background, basically, so European, North American, Australian, whatever of Western background, right? Then okay, yes, this stuff is all valid. That there is the Judeo-Christian personality there, but there was stuff that came before that. There were all these other little idiosyncratic beliefs, and that are different country to country and region to region.
Mhm.
And these are interesting stories that also can't be pulled out of this so easily, right? But then all of the and well, so I mean, maybe as just an example, the Christmas holiday picked up in Western society anyway, picked up a lot of elements of Germanic winter solstice festivities. The Christmas tree, as an example, comes from that type of imagery, right? And so the thing is, these substrates can go deeper and deeper and deeper, right? Human history is really long. We can only go back so far for what has been written down and what has been understood and all this, right? But the point I'm trying to get at here is that you can't ever take away that Western society for 1,000 years had Judeo-Christian thinking at its core.
Yes.
And then maybe get into that there was the humanism wave and different modes of thinking that have influenced society, even if societies were nominally still Christian, right? They were taking on new ideas, right? But the point is that you can't get rid of the Judeo-Christian underpinning, and that's kind of the one of the big points that I think Dr. Peterson is making generally.
Yeah, if you're using that software analogy, right? It's like the basic operating system, something like that, right? You can't just rip out the OS of your computer and expect the applications to function, for instance.
If you are a business owner or manager, you should know these three numbers: 36,000, 25, and 1. 36,000 is the number of businesses that have upgraded to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, which allows you to streamline accounting, financial management, human resources, and more. NetSuite turns 25 years old this year. That's 25 years of helping businesses do more with less, close their books in days rather than weeks, and to drive down cost. And finally, 1, because your business is one of a kind. So with NetSuite, you get a customized solution for all your key performance indicators in one efficient system with one source of truth. NetSuite is everything you need all in one place. Right now, you can download NetSuite's popular KPI checklist designed to give you consistently excellent performance absolutely free at netsuite.com/whatismoney. That's netsuite.com/whatismoney to get your free KPI checklist. Again, netsuite.com/whatismoney.
I'm going to back up a little bit too, because I think this helped me understand it too. Thinking in terms of systems, and this is back on PDF page 237. Peterson writes, Gödel's incompleteness theorem demonstrated that any internally consistent and logical system of propositions must necessarily be predicated upon assumptions that cannot be proved from within the confines of that system. Now, I read this as the absolute essential nature of axioms, right? Axioms being unshakable assumptions to build theorems upon in a logically consistent system. The classic example would be Euclidean geometry, right? One of the axioms is two parallel lines never touch. Not something that you go out into nature and empirically observe or validate. It's just an assumption built into the logic of Euclidean geometry as a mathematical system. And the thing about axioms is that they're like the anchor points that the system goes beyond itself in a way that you can't prove. You can provide a mathematical proof that two parallel lines never touch, but it's almost by definition, because the word parallel means equidistant. And if you define two parallel lines as two lines that are equidistant at all points, that means they never touch. So it's like you kind of reached the limitations of the words, but you've done the best you can with words to define it and reach beyond the words themselves. And so, we talk about the axiom of action a lot in terms of praxeology. That's another one that I think is interesting, because no matter what you say or do, it's a means to an end. And the axiom of action says we use means to pursue ends. So it sort of reaches beyond the domain of words and into the realm of praxis. And so it's an axiomatic foundation to Austrian economics and praxeology. And in this nested paradigmatic structure. You know, we said mythology or religion is the most implicit or the most foundational layer to it. There's this idea of God, right? In religion and mythology, the omniscient, omnipotent, omnipresent, all powerful thing. I think you could, when I try to describe this practically, I could say you could just use God as the word for that which is beyond words. And so God sort of is axiomatic to mythology or religion, in that it's just saying that there's this unshakable assumption that there is great wisdom beyond words, right? We can't capture everything in words. That's why we talk about God as kind of the placeholder for all of that. And so just in the same way you couldn't remove two parallel lines never touch, or you couldn't remove the axiom of action, you can't really remove God from this nested structure and expect any of the rest of it to work. So these, diehard atheists that say, "Oh, God's just, guy in the sky fairy tale," I don't think they're understanding the philosophical slash mythological indispensability of this notion. And you don't have to consider it supernaturally necessarily. It's just you need, in a logical system, you need a category for that which is beyond categorization, something like that.
I think that's a fantastic point. And another thing that I was thinking about with the that you can't take this stuff out of it, right? Like I have personal experience here where I tried to get rid of the Judeo-Christian out of my life, basically, and it didn't work, right? And I think that the thing about this is it's entirely possible, I think, for someone to become an atheist, reject religion, and still have a perfectly good foundation of life, and alternatives such as praxeology are very good here because they provide this similar structure, right? But for me, it really did not work to just rip out the Judeo-Christian programming here and get rid of the entire concept of God. And that it's atheist nihilism that was really what I found. And I know that's not the same thing for everyone, but it was the absolute absence of any form of meaning. And that's what motivated my search to find meaning by another way, right? And so the thing here is that this God concept not being supernatural necessarily, but still being real. I think that's kind of the point here, is that the idea of God is real to the extent that we as people, we as humans, act like God is real and act like categorization outside of what is the known is real. And that's also the key word, is we act, right?
That's right.
Taking it back to praxis. It's the actions are the important thing here. And maybe coming back to the Euclidean geometry point here, right? Proving this stuff, okay, that's great. Going and actually doing some form of mathematics, which has its own, it's got its own, it's similar to Bitcoin. Is Bitcoin an invention or discovery? Mathematics is mathematics an invention or discovery? It's got the same thing. That doing the mathematics to prove something like this, that's important if it's possible, right? But you can still do it from first principles, And so this a priori versus a posteriori thinking is still important here. And then it brings it back to the concept of implicitness that we touched on initially, right? These things that are made implicit are things we don't have to think about anymore.
That's right.
Right? So we can continue to act in the world without needing to consciously think about this stuff, this way of being, this way of organizing ourselves. And so the importance of this implicitness, right? I think if you rip that out, that creates this absolute void in how do I act in the world, right? The anxiety epidemic among young people, that's the first thing that comes to mind there. If you can't go out into the world because you just have no concept of how to handle each situation implicitly,
Yes.
well, how can you handle life? I mean,
Yes.
I feel bad for anyone with that affliction, because it's of course not all cases of anxiety are caused by this ripping out of the software, but I think it really explains a lot of it, you know.
No, absolutely. And the implicitness is a means of economizing how we deal with complexity, right? If you had to approach every problem as a novel problem every day, how do I sew my shirt? How do I build a table? How do I build a door? How do I make shoes? Like, we could never accumulate knowledge or capital and liberate ourselves to solve higher, more difficult problems. And this reminds me of the excellent quote. This is one of my favorite quotes from philosopher Alfred North Whitehead. He writes, civilization advances by extending the number of important operations which we can perform without thinking about them. Operations of thought are like cavalry charges in battle. They are strictly limited in number, they require fresh horses, and must only be made at decisive moments. So the more we can make things automatic or implicit, the more we're actually liberating ourselves to go and do other things. And this is the essence of economic productivity, right? The fact that you have a refrigerator that will keep food cold and or frozen for weeks and months, and you don't have to go find fresh food from the land every single day. How much liberation does that give you in terms of time and energy to do other things? So this idea, it is so ubiquitous in a way, and we must be very careful to, well, this is a Peterson quote too, right? Clean up your room before you criticize the world. You might not understand the value of these implicit structures, but they are the invisible substrate to your individual personality, your culture, your country to some extent. Obviously, in fiat world, the U.S. today, right, the Biden administration is attacking some of these structures by attacking rationality and definitions. That's a very dangerous thing. It's cloaked in compassion, but when you attack definitions, you're undermining our ability for rationality. So these things are all just tremendously important.
Forget multivitamins and other supplements. Animal organs are the most nutrient-dense foods on the planet. You can get 100 times more nutrients from organs than you can from muscle meats. But the problem with eating organs is that they are difficult to find in stores, they are difficult to prepare, and even when they are prepared well, they often don't taste great. Thankfully, Heart and Soil Supplements has made consuming organ meats so much easier by providing powderized organs in capsule form. Organ meats include everything your body needs to thrive: vitamins, minerals, peptides, proteins, and growth factors. This is why organ meats were the most prized foods for our ancestors. Fortunately for us, Heart and Soil makes these treasured foods easily accessible. So go to heartandsoil.co today and use discount code BREEDLOVE to get started on your journey to optimal health and vitality. Again, that's heartandsoil.co, discount code BREEDLOVE.
Yeah, well, and actually, so can I just one point from what you were just touching on there, the quote about cleaning up your room before criticizing the world, right? I think that one gets a lot of misunderstandings generally in terms of what that's actually implying. It to me, it's not really that you can't ever criticize something if you see that that it's wrong, right?
Of course.
And the reaction to that, I think, was especially in young people, the negative reaction to that quote, because it's implying that the causes that young people are interested in, climate and equity and all these sorts of things, well, yeah, maybe they should do some thinking and some work,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe they wouldn't necessarily be quite so into those causes, the fixing the world, right?
Mm.
but the thing about it is that this tracks exactly with what we've been talking about, you know. I think the quote really means understand what came before you
Mm.
and
Mhm.
work on your life as an individual first. Fix the things that are in your control to fix and or improve on, right?
Mhm.
Doing those things first, becoming a better person. Well, if then you still want to use your resources on, so to say, fixing the world, well, okay, then you're a better equipped person to do that. And maybe you also have a better perspective on this because of the journey of self-improvement and self-reflection. But it also doesn't necessarily say that because nobody's perfect, right?
Right.
Perfection isn't the goal here. I think it's just a general way of approaching life with humility. You know,
Yes,
the
exactly.
quote is really about humility. Yeah.
Yes.
So
Excellent point. Excellent point. Because again, these things are implicit, and if they've been around longer than you, which they probably have, then there could be reasons for their existence that you just don't understand. So to just go out and openly criticize them would lack humility.
yeah. So I really like that quote, that idea.
Yeah.
And I think the backlash against it, the negative feelings towards it are because it's misunderstood. It's
Yes.
it's it's really it's not saying achieve perfection, and then it's a um there are ad hominem attacks against Dr. Peterson himself because he doesn't have a clean room himself necessarily, or his struggles with barbiturate dependency
Yeah.
and
Right.
all this,
Right.
right? Like from legitimate medical use and all this, like it's ironically the same thing. It's uh,
Yes.
people criticizing him, even though he's made these immense contributions with these books. But no one's perfect. Everyone has their journey, right?
Of course. Of course. And I would be remiss maybe to not say here that we criticize central banking a lot on this show, and that's a very big old structure. Predates me, predates all of us that are alive, basically. Um, and so I do think about that, right? Like, well, and Peterson, when we had our interview together, he made that very argument. He's like, well, if this thing has existed for so long, maybe there's reasons you don't understand. And I tend to agree in a way that like we needed to solve certain problems with the portability of gold, but I think those problems are now solvable in a way that don't require the centralization and monopolization and counterfeiting of money. And based on what I've read, this is from people that come before me, I share their criticisms of that institution, right? This is not something I just formulated on my own somewhere. So yes, you're right. It is okay to criticize the world, call out wrongdoing where you see it. Another quote that's from someone else, but if you see a fraud and do not say fraud, then you are a fraud. So it is okay to, this is part of the adaptive hero, the revolutionary hero we're talking about. It's his job to go out and say, hey, this doesn't work as well as it could or as good as it could. So here's the change we need. And culture and the world needs that. So it's a balance, right? It's not black or white.
Yeah, I mean, but how many hours of work did you put in before getting to these conclusions, right? I
Yes,
mean,
exactly.
how many hours of your work have so many other people by proxy, right?
Yes.
Even just your series with Michael Saylor as a start, as a jumping off point, and that kind of is the point that when critiquing these existing structures, especially when it comes to money and with Bitcoin as the
Mhm.
as the solution here, right? Well, yeah, everyone here who has gotten all the way to the end of that Bitcoin is the solution and all the other things are at best less good
Mhm.
and at worst total scams.
Mhm.
Well, it's because of investigating hard and spending time
Yes.
to understand the problem and think through what is the actual solution, right?
Yeah.
And if there was a solution where, hey, central banks could change the way they operate, I mean, they could change the way they operate, and a lot of things would get fixed. It doesn't mean that there really is no way into the system where the power goes back to the individuals, though, right? It's still centralized
Yeah.
control, but still some changes could be made. But who makes those changes voluntarily when there's power in someone's hands? Who gives that up voluntarily? That's is difficult, right? So
Yes. Yeah. And the Nietzsche quote comes to mind, right? Madness is not normal in individuals, but the norm in crowds and groups. And yeah, I don't know. We just need something that we ourselves cannot corrupt or break, seems to be the general solution. But I don't want to take us too far afield.
oh, we've
I
really
just
digressed
wanted to
there, yeah.
mention that as kind of a personal example. Like, you can criticize, you should criticize the world, but make sure you do it with an ounce of humility, right? Because the world's very complicated. It's been around a lot longer than you, so tread lightly.
Yeah, so I think pulling us back into where we were talking about here, and I think this quote we've already sort of gotten into the idea here, but I'll read it. So, a paradigm is a complex cognitive tool whose use presupposes acceptance of a limited number of axioms or definitions of what constitutes reality for the purposes of argument and action, whose interactions produce an internally consistent explanatory and predictive structure. Paradigmatic thinking might be described as thinking whose domain has been formally limited, thinking that acts as if some questions have been answered in a final manner. The limitations of the domain, quote unquote, or the quote unquote answers to the questions make up the axiomatic statements of the paradigm, which are, according to Kuhn, quote unquote, explicitly formulated, semantically represented according to the argument set forth here, or left implicit, embedded in episodic fantasy or embedded behavior. It goes on, but I think the point that this was getting at here is everything we've just been talking about, making this stuff implicit through being able to turn the world into these axioms and then acting as if they exist.
I actually think the last sentence is pretty important too. He says the validity of the axioms must either be accepted on faith or at least demonstrated using an approach which is external to the paradigm in question, which amounts to the same thing as faith from within the paradigm perspective. So, and this was mind blowing for me, but and this was from John Vervaeke, that there is no such thing as a scientific way to prove the value of science. Like, and this goes all the way back to Plato, that there's an assumption or an axiom taken on faith, it cannot be proven, that the structures of our intelligibility, our ability to understand the world around us, track the actual structures of reality. We can't prove that with any scientific experiment. It's literally the faith that's at the bottom of science. So there's this strange, and faith is obviously typically a word loaded with religious connotation, but it's almost like a letting go. It's like you just have to trust this one thing to build the rest of this structure. And that, that's an interesting one, right? Even Bitcoin, I would say, sort of has an element of that. We're trusting individual self-interest. You can't verify it. You can't prove it. You could look at history and say, well, people tend to do this, like tend to follow their incentives over time, but there's not a mathematical proof for it. So, people that would dispense with faith, I think they just don't have this level of understanding of what it actually is.
Yeah, that point is fascinating, and I think the thing there is this comes back in so many ways these days. I mean, the idea of trust the science. I mean, that is faith in a different way too.
Mm-hmm.
Like the mainstream scientific narrative, there are overlays to this, right?
Yeah.
Science, technology, advancement of any kind can have an agenda.
Sure.
And there are so many ways that this embodies, right? And I think that it shows that there is the capacity for the same type of corruption that we were talking about with central banks, the corruption of power and being the one to decide what the truth is, or what should be the truth, should be disseminated as the truth, something like that. And I mean, with your example of Bitcoin, even here, there are so many parts to how the technology works, and I'm being specific about the technology, the actual bones of what the protocol allows. I mean, not to dig too much into a specific controversial issue here, but there are uses of Bitcoin that may not necessarily be what many would agree are valid, like encoding images or other data onto the blockchain, right? Like that to me is very counter to the ideas of what Bitcoin actually is, but the protocol allows for it, and it's required some exploitation of so-called well, loopholes are one way to describe it in the protocol, but other ways of basically breaking the system as it exists as far as possible. And then you get an environment where the battle for scarce block space is taken up by this data, right?
Yes.
So not to dig into this too much, but the point I'm getting at is that the faith of the system and the operation of this is in the control of the people who make these technological changes and disseminate it out. The users get to decide, the node runners get to decide what is actually run on their software, right? But there are developers and there are discussions that go on about what keeps the system working. And this isn't the right forum for like discussing this in depth, but
to tie it into this a little bit though, and we could move on, but it is interesting to me that, first of all, you're right. It's a sort of a direct democracy, right? That the individuals that run nodes are deciding which code is best for them. So there's no distortion through like a legislative apparatus or anything. It's very direct. And the battle is taking place, but since the law can't do much about it, Bitcoin is sort of its own self-contained law. The battle's taking place in the moral domain, right? People are saying, okay, this is an illegitimate use of this tool. And some people say, well, it's a permissionless tool. I can do whatever I want with it. And so, and Bitcoin, that's great that Bitcoin tolerates all of that. And you can have these disputes and let social consensus sort it out. So yeah, it just sort of reinforces some of the point we're saying here, that there is this implicit element of morality, even in Bitcoin. And what's underneath that, it's like faith in some ideal, whatever your ideal vision of Bitcoin is. That's what you are arguing on behalf of, presumably.
Yeah, I'll leave any discussions of those specific topics for other episodes and other podcasts potentially. But no, I agree with your point very much. And so, I think this paradigmatic structure, the lesson from this section, I think is just this understanding that there are these layers underneath everything, and they're important, and you can't get rid of them. To me, that's the summation of this section.
Every social construct, from the individual to the family to the company to the nation state to the money to Bitcoin itself, has a mythological dimension, structure. I don't know what term we want to put here, a pattern. And that's what makes this book so ubiquitous in its application, right? It's very close to the nature of being itself, insofar as social creatures or creations are concerned. And it's so hard to get your head around it. It's so dense. It applies to everything. It sounds really out there at first. You're like, what are these guys talking about? Dragons and shit. But it's, again, there's a reason these stories have persisted for so long. And it's because they have very broad and useful application.
100%. And so I think the to round off what we're trying to cover here into today's session, I think this is a good segue into the forms of anomaly, and I think we'll sort of leave things on a little bit of a cliffhanger with, here are these things that challenge our ways of thinking, and
Yes.
not really get into solutions yet necessarily. But
Yes.
what do you think? Should we get into that?
I love the idea, and I would say it is these things challenge the structure we've been discussing, but it's not necessarily, it is antagonistic in a way, but it's a healthy antagonism because it's the antagonism that drives the adaptation of that structure, right? Obviously, you can have things that are strange that are bad, strangers that are bad, strange ideas that are bad that need to get discarded, but some of these things are good and useful for the structure, and they need to get absorbed into it over time. So I think we're moving from describing the stability of the structure to the adaptivity of the structure.
Over the past 9 years, I've been going through a pretty serious struggle with my personal health. It started with a sharp pain and stiffness in my hip after a lifting injury, which I later learned was related to some pretty extensive inflammation in my gut. Then I developed an autoimmune issue, and soon I was having joint pain all over, skin irritations, and all kinds of digestive issues. I visited many doctors trying to figure out what was wrong, but none of them were able to help me fix any of my issues. I eventually started to see an energy healer with whom I had some limited success, but it wasn't until I started working with the biohacker Anthony DiClemente last year that I was finally able to start making real progress on my healing journey. Anthony spent a lot of time with me learning about my specific situation and worked with me to adapt a custom health plan to address my needs. Anthony has served as a personal biohacker for celebrities, billionaires, and professional athletes all over the world. Besides helping people like me overcome health issues, Anthony and his world-class medical team also help guys that just want to optimize their cognitive performance, guys that want to pack on some muscle, and guys that just want to get shredded. Anthony keeps a tight book of business and is selective about the clients he brings on. To apply for Anthony's biohacking services, text Breedlove to 847-943-7221. Again, to apply for Anthony's biohacking services, just text Breedlove to 847-943-7221.
You've got it. So where should we start here? Move into the stranger and the strange idea.
Absolutely. I could read one unless you've got one.
I've got it here to
Okay.
just kind of introduce this
Go for
topic, and I can just say in advance here to just to simplify it, these three things. The strange is referring to strange things,
Yeah.
strange things that happen. The stranger are unknown people, and
Yeah.
specifically people thinking in a different way. And then strange ideas are those things that challenge our ways of thinking. So here's, I think, a good excerpt here. Anomalous events share capacity to threaten the integrity of the known, to disrupt the quote-unquote familiar and explored. Such events, while differing in their specific details and manner of manifestation, tend to occupy the same natural category. Threats to the stability of cultural tradition emerge in four quote-unquote mythologically inseparable manners: through rapid natural environmental shift, independent of human activity, through contact with a heretofore isolated foreign culture, through application of novel, revolutionary, linguistically or episodically mediated critical skill, the inevitable consequence of increasing ability to abstract, learn, and communicate, and as the consequence of revolutionary heroic activity. So, yeah, it's a little bit of a dense way of putting this forward, but he's getting into these concepts of, well, maybe just one more paragraph here. The quote unquote natural human tendency to respond to the stranger, the strange idea, and the creative individual with fear and aggression can be more easily comprehended once it is understood that these diverse phenomena share categorical identity with the quote unquote natural disaster. The problem with this so-called natural response pattern, however, is that the upsetting capacity of the anomalous is simultaneously the vital source of interest, meaning, and individual strength. Furthermore, the ability to upset ourselves, to undermine and revitalize our own beliefs, is an intrinsic, necessary, and, quote, divine aspect of the human psyche, part of the seminal word itself.
Yes.
So, yeah, this is just to start out with that. What he's saying here, in my reading of this, is that these unknown things are necessary, even if they are upsetting. To put it simply.
Yes. No, really, really good stuff. What jumps out to me here is that where he's describing what threatens the stability of cultural tradition. And towards the end, he says, increasing ability to abstract, learn, and communicate as a consequence of revolutionary heroic activity. We've talked previously about how the hero in an economic sense is the entrepreneur, right? So the entrepreneur that invents something new and useful that the entire world copies. I think this is why going into the digital age is feeling like such a paradigmatic change, because we have radically changed our ability to abstract, to learn, and to communicate, right? Software is a moving modular abstraction that we're starting to use to mediate almost all of our experiences and interactions, business, personal, dating, finances, like almost everything we do now is through digital technology. And then he's saying later on at the end of the second paragraph that the intrinsic, necessary, and divine aspect of the human psyche is the ability to undermine and revitalize our own beliefs. And I think this is so fascinating about language and knowledge, that the purpose of language and knowledge is to subvert itself, right? You're trying to convert an experience into words or an idea into words. But if you reach far enough and you discover a new idea or a new tool or a new technology, well, all of a sudden you need new words to describe that experience. So words are, and a typical example here, when we say something like, oh, that's a feature, not a bug. Well, that makes sense today because we have digital tools and technologies. That did not make sense 30 years ago, right? So there's all these little aphorisms, if you will, and it's almost like it feels like empiricism to me, right? Where empiricism is, you can never prove a hypothesis, you can just disprove everything else, and whatever's left over is like empirical truth. You're kind of doing the same with words. Like, you undermine everything you can, and whatever's left over is the best way we can describe what is.
Yeah, and the thing about the language as well, another point there is that it's another way we make this stuff implicit, right? Like
Yeah.
when we put meaning into a word,
Yes.
then we no longer have to do all of this work to explain what the word is. Language is almost the original way of doing this that's unique to humanity. Nothing else has language. I love language. I'm fascinated by it, and
Same.
different languages structuring themselves in different ways, coming at it from possibly the same origin. It's not actually 100% certain that all language started from the same one little group of original humans, though. It's not 100% certain that that's the case. And you get all these language families, and we all have these different ways of communicating together. Speaking a different language gives people, you start to actually think differently if you speak another language, two or more languages. And yeah, I think that point is really fascinating there. So yeah, I think the whole thing that this is really coming up with here is that when we put this paradigm together, when we get this paradigm together of how to view the world, which by the way, we were looking up offline that the meaning of the word paradigm is like something like pattern, right? I think that was what it was.
Yeah, it's if we go all the way to the Proto-Indo-European root, which is the original language from which most languages come, not all, but it means to show or to pronounce solemnly. And then later interpretations meant an example, a model, or a pattern or an example. So really, it's holding things side by side, which sounded like, ratio or rationality to me, like an actual frame of reference, if you will.
Yeah, and so if we take that as the beginning here, that we have a pattern or something like that, a pattern for understanding. Well, what happens when something challenges that? And to a certain extent, what we discussed in the earlier parts of the book, the order and chaos and the sort of the story structure, that's certainly one way to think about it. But now we're getting into a little bit of what actually happens in these different cases. So I think that's what we can go into next.
Mm-hmm. Do we go to the strange first?
Yeah, so
Okay.
so I think to just cover the strange briefly, because I think this is sort of the easiest thing to understand, that the strange being an unexpected event, essentially, at least what the way he's saying it. Um he's even really referring to natural phenomena
Mm-hmm.
that occur from prolonged drought, floods, earthquakes, plagues, things like that. Um, well, like the quote is: prolonged drought, floods, earthquakes, plagues, nature's most horrifying and arbitrary occurrences are capable of rendering the most carefully adapted societies impotent at a single blow,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so the idea here, the flood myth is sort of the the proto example of this, right? Where the world is wiped clean by a flood as the result of humanity's hubris,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
basically. That's what the stories say. It's very likely that there were real floods that caused this myth to become so pervasive in humanity. But the thing about this is that we we can take a moral lesson out of the response to natural disasters, right? Have you done
Mm-hmm.
enough to prepare? Has
Right.
society done enough to prepare for this? And that gets into a little bit of concept of time preference, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
have resources been stowed away for to deal with these unexpected events, which really on a long enough time scale, nothing should be unexpected. That events like floods are measured in what is the flood that's going to happen every 100 years, every 1,000 years, something like that. It's going to occur on some kind of frequency, right? So
Yeah.
that's, I think, the idea of the strange in brief. It really is a short section dealing with that.
Yeah, you could probably summarize it in the colloquial phrase that shit happens, right? And the deluge, the flood is apt because the deluge myth is basically universal, right? I think most cultures, most religions around the world have some version of it, which is why with that level of consilience makes us think, well, it really happened, right? It was some type of either raising of the sea levels or something that flooded the world. I don't know too much about the details, but I do know that that myth is all over the world within civilizations that otherwise didn't have contact.
Yeah, if you want to dig into this in a fun way, the work of Graham Hancock
Yes.
is my particular favorite on this topic. It's maybe considered a little controversial and pseudoscientific, but that I think it's pretty compelling in terms of explanations for this. So yeah, um, Magicians of the Gods is a very good
Fingerprints
book.
of the Gods, is that the one?
Fingerprints of the Gods.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
And then he has the Netflix series too. I think Ancient Civilizations, Mysteries of Ancient Civilizations.
Yeah, something like
I
that.
forget the title, but that
Very
was
good stuff.
yeah, really good. And his appearances on Joe Rogan podcast, phenomenal.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Yep.
for
Yep.
sure.
Good stuff to get into there, but not for us to cover, I think.
Yeah.
But the next part about the stranger, I think, unless you had anything more on this
No, I think it's
strange.
pretty straightforward, It's just we're building civilization as kind of like a walled garden to push back the uncertainty of the natural world in a way, right? To resist scarcity and natural disasters and et cetera. That's sort of the general human enterprise.
Yeah, you got it. I think that's a fantastic way of putting it. And so then coming into the next category though is that there's the pushback against nature, right? But then there's the pushback against people who don't necessarily share the same paradigm. And that's I think the reason why building up this concept of paradigm is so important here. That when encountering a stranger, someone literally that you don't know, right? What is the way you can understand them at a very short, brief instant, right? If you share the same culture, right, you automatically can say that we share at least the same levels of substrate going down potentially massive levels, right? Like if someone is from the United States, as in you know, I mean not to get political on this, but born and raised in the United States, something like that. Speaks English natively, something like that. You can make certain assumptions about what this person is going to be when you encounter them, right? But then if you encounter someone that is different, doesn't speak the same language, doesn't come from the same background, something like that, the origins of this are that they might have had completely different cultural underpinnings, right? And the implication is if you have different underlying software, right? Well, how can you predict how that person is going to act?
Right.
And so it takes away all of the work done to make the world predictable.
Yes.
When encountering the stranger.
Yes. I like this analogy because it's, again, we say culture in general sort of lets us decrease the cost of establishing or maintaining trust. Like especially if someone you're very close to culturally, right? They're from your town, they go to your church, they have your dialect or accent. Like all of these things lend themselves to having a very easy degree of at least establishing and presumably maintaining trust over time. But if you don't have those commonalities, then it's much more difficult, right? You don't know this person's value system. You might not speak their language. If you do speak their language, you might not speak the same dialect, or it might not be their first language, so they don't speak it properly. All of those things increase the cost of maintaining and establishing trust. And again, if culture is sort of premised on religion, if you go to the same church with someone, you have probably a very low cost of establishing trust, right? You know what they're about, you see the same pastor, et cetera. And I've always thought it was a little bit interesting to think about that money also serves that purpose to some extent, that you can really work with strangers, basically. And it's like, as long as you both agree to the rule of law in the contract and you agree to the payment, right? You value the money, whatever it is, Bitcoin, gold, dollars, et cetera, then you can establish and maintain trust with complete strangers, right? You can go to another country, hand them a piece of plastic, and they'll rent you a car for a week. And then, you'll get an invoice after it's done and the accounting is perfect from Visa or MasterCard or whoever it is. Like all of those coordinations that don't require a lot of trust. You didn't need to vet the people a lot. Like it's possible because of these shared maps, whether they are, money, culture, religion, etc.
Yeah, so I think the interesting point that comes out of this here, right? When we take away that cost of trust, as you say, that when dealing with the strange individual, the stranger, it's really got to be done carefully for it to work, right? Trade, if we're going back thousands of years, it was really on the margins, right? It's like two individuals seeing each other across a river, and then I've got this bundle of wood and you've got those apples and I'm going to put them down here and we're going to make an exchange and blah blah blah, and okay, that works, right? And when it's done on the margins, right, when you can still have sort of a wall around the internal civilization structure, okay, then exchanges are always voluntary, right? going out intentionally to be the stranger or seek the stranger or something like that, seek the outside information, that's done intentionally. And what's brought back is done intentionally, right? But then you get into cases where historically, I mean, this is the creation of conflict, right? Scarce resources and people fighting for those scarce resources, right? You might not necessarily trust the neighboring tribe because you might go to war over resources one day, right? So we as civilization have done so many things to protect ourselves from the unknown and these things that come up as a result of that. But then we still have to deal with that people have other cultures. And I think it's self-evident today that there are ways to to enable this to be done the wrong way, basically, where there can be pockets of people who don't share the same culture cultural assumptions, so to say, or the same underlying software, and that creates issues with social cohesion, basically, and it's not a problem that can just be solved away by saying that diversity is our strength.
Right. Yeah, and I also think travel is so important in this regard, to just expose yourself to many different cultures, and you develop an appreciation for how different the world really can be. Really good for children, I think, too, right? Just to have exposure to multiple cultures so that they understand how this works, basically.
Yeah, and well, maybe just to actually say directly what Dr. Peterson is writing here, I can give one paragraph here. When the members of one isolated group come into contact with the members of another, the stage is therefore set for trouble. Each culture, each group evolved to protect its individual members from the unknown, from the abysmal forces of the great and the terrible mother, from unbearable affect itself. Each evolved to structure social relationships and render them predictable, to provide a goal and the means to attain it. All cultures provide their constituent individuals with particular modes of being in the face of terror and uncertainty. All cultures are stable, integrated, hierarchically arranged structures predicated upon assumptions held as absolute. But the particular natures of these assumptions differ, at least at the more comprehensible and, quote, conscious level of analyses. Every culture represents an idiosyncratic paradigm, a pattern of behaving in the face of the unknown. And the paradigm cannot be shifted, its basic axioms cannot be modified, without dramatic consequences, without disillusion, metaphorical death, prior to potential reconstruction. And my take on this paragraph basically is that when encountering other cultures and other systems of belief, which sort of bleeds into the next concept, the strange idea, it comes directly against the existing paradigm that the culture has grown up to develop to protect, right? And the point of that is that everyone's cultural programming, their own paradigm, so to say, was developed for the same reason. Every culture developed to do the same thing, to guard against the unknown. It's just that the different features of that come from different experiences, different environments, different histories, right? And so the main thing is first of all is that every individual kind of gets this stuff and can't really help it, right? But then when you get into the marketplace of ideas is when necessarily you get into these patterns of conflict, and why it's so important, I think, to have a base cultural understanding for any society on any level, whether it's town, city, country, to function. There's got to be a baseline that everyone in the system adopts, or you get this case where you run into cultural mythological strangers constantly, right? And that's not good for individual mental well-being, I think.
Yeah. As Peterson wrote, that its axioms cannot be moved without sort of shaking their identity and culture to the core, right? So this probably explains religious conflict, right? People go to war saying, my God is the real God, and the other group saying the same thing. But again, this mythological view sort of lets you step out of that dichotomy and say it's not like right versus wrong religion. These are both social constructs or even a form of capital, right? Culture is a form of capital that emerged to do the same thing. Yours might have particular features that are different than mine, but they're both technologies effectively designed to do the same thing. And then I think this also segues us nicely into the strange idea, because that's basically what that is. Two cultures come together and they're like, wait, their religion is a strange idea. And that can obviously lead to conflict.
Well, exactly. And then maybe we can just get into the initial quote here to explain the strange idea concept. Increasing ability to abstract makes previous learning established through non-abstract means increasingly modifiable and increasingly vulnerable. In a way, this is the whole point of abstraction and the very capacity to learn. Words, deceptively simple and harmless, are sufficient to create disruption and conflict because Homo sapiens can verbalize his beliefs. It could be said, therefore, with sufficient rationale, that a new idea is an abstract stranger, or by the same logic, a natural disaster. It is for this reason that the pen is mightier than the sword. So I think from my side, this quote is really encapsulating. And this is a really common theme in this book, honestly, that it's always these layers, right? Layers build on top of each other. We have this idea of this paradigmatic structure of the known that has the mythology at the bottom and builds up and up and up into the individual. And then we have these ideas that you have. The strange idea is built upon the idea of that it's really a stand-in for the stranger, which is a stand-in for a natural disaster.
Yes.
And if this is just another thing I just want to emphasize here is that I think the point that the book is making, that Dr. Peterson is making here is that this is how the human operating system works. It's not, this isn't making a moral judgment. It's just saying that this is how humanity works to deal with patterns of the unknown, right?
Yes.
And so, I mean, I think the main point of this entire section is really just to say that there are these ideas that can that a new idea has the exact same capacity as a natural disaster to disrupt the known, right? And these are the things that the individual needs to be able to encounter and handle as the hero to foreshadow a little bit about what we'll cover next time.
Yeah, absolutely. And what prophets, scientists, philosophers, activists, artists, revolutionaries, these are people that often are messengers of strange ideas, and they're often met initially with a lot of resistance because it's again attacking that axiom or something close to the axiom on whatever that civilization is predicated upon. And that creates identity crises in the individuals that adhere to that culture. Galileo, Copernicus, people, even like more recent Martin Luther King Jr., right? This all these people carrying these ideas that flew in the face of certain conventional wisdoms, let's say. They're reviled at first, and then if the idea is good, then it gets absorbed, right? And now we don't fight over whether the sun is the center of the solar system or not. And I guess that the through line here between the strange, the stranger, and the strange idea is just that novelty, right? Again, how do we deal with novelty? How do we either throw out evaluate the idea, throw out the bad ones, and assimilate the good ones? It seems like a painful process, though. It's not like the good idea just shows up on our doorstep and we're like, oh, this is wonderful, bring it right in. It has to kind of go through this gauntlet of of resistance at both the individual and cultural level, oftentimes.
Yeah, and I think the real point at the end of it there, when ideas are a marketplace, right? This should be that the best idea wins out.
Yeah.
But then individuals get all of this programming that makes it
Yes.
hard,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
So that changing one's mind necessarily does not come easy, you
Yeah.
know? And I think that's one of the things that this book I think is really actually getting at, is to become the type of individual that can take on new ideas and absorb them and come out with the good parts of it at the end. So that's the optimistic part that we're going to be digging into a little bit more in the further upcoming sections here.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to that. And you reminded me of something there, that towards the end of Human Action, Mises says, if a tool is more useful than another tool, it tends to win out in the marketplace. Like, there's not a lot of resistance to it, right? If there's a new shovel invented, well, eventually most people use that shovel. But ideologies are a little bit different, because they are belief systems, or they're culture, products of culture, that there tend to be a lot of people, rhetoricians speaking out against it. And so that can confuse people over time. Like, is this a good idea or not? The piece I wrote, The Number Zero in Bitcoin, like, a zero-based numeral system was way more useful than all the other numeral systems. But because it threatened church dogma, it was resisted, right? There was, it was made illegal. You couldn't use it and all this weird stuff. But in the end, it wins out because it's useful. So just important to think about that let's say, psychotechnologies or social constructs or ideas, they don't have that same high level of probability that they're just going to win out. Like, they actually need people to represent them and discuss them and advocate for them. It's not a foregone conclusion, for instance, that Bitcoin is going to win, right? We actually need people that are going to talk about it, use it, build on it, etc. So, yeah, that's all I got to say about that.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's definitely it is part of why I think everyone in the space is so passionate about it, right?
Yeah.
That putting forward that feeling so strongly about this idea,
Yeah.
that the capacity to change the world and for the better, and the resistance to it from all sides, really. Yeah, it's important to talk about this stuff, and to say why this is important and why challenging the existing belief structures is worthwhile. And I mean, this is part of why this book is important to me, is that it's helpful for understanding how the world works.
Yeah.
Again, without moral judgments, without saying how it should be. It's just this is how the world is structured, and understanding it better. And then maybe I, as an individual, with that better understanding of how I think and how the world around me operates, because the world is made up of individuals, well, maybe I can better navigate the world, and maybe I can better advocate for the things that are important to me, which, well, yeah, for me, the most important thing in the world is Bitcoin. That's why I'm here, why I'm working on this stuff. And I think same for you, or at least one of the most important things, not words in your mouth, but yeah.
Yeah,
That's
no,
it.
yeah, we're both core components of the Bitcoin network. It's what do they say? You don't change Bitcoin, Bitcoin changes you. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
Gets you talking about deep, crazy mythology and psychology on a podcast. Who knew that was a thing?
It's awesome. It's surreal, man. The surreal doesn't end. For me, the surreal doesn't end. It's really cool.
Yeah, same here. Luke, man, thank you so much. I look forward to our next one.
Likewise. Thanks, Robert.